Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. I beg to move that a bill entitled an Act to supplement the appropriation of the sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Financial Year 2022, Act 2021, be now read a second time. Madam President, how much time do I have?
You have 45 minutes.
Thank you very much. Madam President, this is a finance bill, and it has been passed in the other place. I wish to state at the outset I intend to stay in my section and deal with the matter at hand. And I will not stray into extraneous matters, so that hopefully the debate can be on the supplementation of appropriation. I could say at the outset that I notice every year now, for over 6 years, whenever there is a supplementation of appropriation or a variation of appropriation bill which deals with movement of money or supplementation of allocations to various heads of expenditure and line items, that notwithstanding the fact that that is what the debate is all about, the same commentary continues every year, that they expect a debate on a supplementation of appropriation to be a second budget speech and to give government policy going forward. Madam President, I want to repeat, I shall stay in my section and deal with the matter before us. The details of the proposed changes were circulated to all senators, and it is anticipated that during the course of the debate, the proposals contained will be addressed by relevant members of the government and senators. At this juncture, let me advise the House, the Senate, that this Honorable House, that the supplementary appropriation for fiscal 2022 of $3,081,703,900 affects 29 heads of expenditure, comprises recurrent expenditure of $2,976,878,900 and development program expenditure of $104,825,000. The funds for the supplementary appropriation will be sourced from the consolidated fund. At this time, we do not envisage any significant borrowing, but if that is necessary, that will be arranged in order to meet the requirements of any supplementary appropriation. The appropriation of $3.081 billion is required to cover liabilities on hand and to meet expenditure to the end of the fiscal year. The heads affected are the Judiciary, the Industrial Court, the Parliament, Service Commissions, Election and Boundaries Commission, Tax Appeal Board, Registration, Recognition and Certification Board, Public Service Appeal Board, Office of the Prime Minister, Tobago House of Assembly, Central Administrative Services Tobago, the Personnel Department, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of National Security, Office of the Attorney General and Ministry of Legal Affairs, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Integrity Commission, Ministry of Public Utilities, Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government, Ministry of Works and Transport, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, Ministry of Planning and Development, Equal Opportunity Tribunal, Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, Ministry of Sport and Community Development, and finally, the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and the Arts. Grand total, $3,081,703,900. 7 of these heads require supplementation in excess of $200 million, as follows. Finance requires a sum of $225,966,500 to supplement the Infrastructure and Development Fund to allow the Ministry of Trade and Industry to pay value-added tax and other costs associated with the construction of the Phoenix Park Industrial Estate, and also to allow the Ministry of National Security's acquisition of a property located at 32 St. James Street, San Fernando, to accommodate the South Office of the Immigration Division. The allocation for value-added tax for that project is $92,066,500. The other costs on the project, $25,900,000. That's the allocation. This does not mean that that will actually be disbursed or spent. It depends on the outcome of certain claims the contractor has. And the allocation for the acquisition of that building in San Fernando for the South Office of Immigration is $8 million. Additionally, the sum of $100 million is being provided to facilitate the initial capitalization of the Secondary Road Rehabilitation and Improvement Company proposed. The Ministry of National Security requires additional funds in the sum of $206,900,000 to cover shortfalls in allocations for payment of remuneration to various officers, fire service, prison service, etc., to pay arrears of traveling and subsistence to officers in the Immigration Division and probation officers, to pay TNTech and TSTT for services provided in the sums of $9 million and $14,200,000. And this is a feature of this supplementation. We've taken the opportunity, because of improved revenues, we've taken the opportunity to clear a number of long outstanding arrears, which cash flow simply did not permit us to clear off in the past. So in this Ministry of National Security appropriation, there's $9 million for TNTech, $14.2 million for TSTT. The Ministry of National Security's additional appropriation also provides for maintenance and repairs of vehicles for the fire service, prison service, defense force, also for vessels. It provides funding for settlement of a debt owed to NIB with respect to transit police in the sum of $3 million. It provides for arrears owed to MTS for janitorial services in $6 million. Further arrears owed to MTS for security services, $19 million. Food for the prison service, $2.5 million. Defense force, $6 million. And that is not arrears, that is carrying forward to September 30th. For replenishment of fleet cards, purchase of fuel, etc., $11 million. It also provides for current transfers and subsidies within the Ministry of National Security for the payment of gratuities to allow the Strategic Services Agency to meet its operational costs and also to pay various expenses incurred by the transit police. The Ministry of Education requires additional funding in the sum of $300 million to pay TNTech again, as I said, a recurring feature of this supplementation, $26.25 million to TNTech, and you will recognize, Madam President, that Ministry of Education has responsibilities for electricity across the entire school system, and $9.025 million for TSTT. Payment of salaries to contract officers, payments to PTSC for school transport by private providers, payment to MTS for janitorial services in the amount of $54 million, and security in the amount of $55 million, payment to WASA, $3.25 million, payment to CXC, $9.8 million, and payment of a number of grants and so on to primary schools, arrears for telephone and water for assisted primary schools, government secondary schools, funding arrangements, interim for Bishop Zancy High School East, Trinity College East, payment of gratuities, school meals, and also to payments to Metal Industries, Skills Development Program for administrative staff, again to September. The Ministry of Health requires a sum of $362,887,700 for the acquisition of COVID-19 vaccines for children and adults, $12.5 million. For the continuing engagement of the ambulance service, $53.37 million. To pay salaries and allowances totaling $274.3 million for the 4 regional health authorities, for personnel assigned to various health facilities within the parallel healthcare system, which is a significant expense that we've carried for the last 2 to 3 years because of COVID. To meet principal payments of $17.7 million and interest on a loan facility at RBC for the acquisition of pharmaceuticals. That's a very expensive item, Madam Speaker. President, sorry. We spend as a country over $1 billion on pharmaceuticals in the public health system. Over $1 billion on free medication in the public health system. The Ministry of Public Utilities requires a sum of $408,400,000 to pay TN-Tech for street lighting and lighting of parks, recreation grounds, $68.4 million. Refunds owed to TN-Tech from the rebates, 25% and 35% granted to rate A, the lowest level of customers with electricity billings of $300 or less, $12 million in rebates. Payment to WASA to meet wages and salaries, $150 million, as well as principal and interest on a US $60 million loan facility to pay DSALCOT, $161 million for principal and a $25 million loan facility to settle an outstanding balance of an existing revolving credit facility. That 161 is in fact the US $25 million loan, and the revolving credit facility allocation is $16 million. Under the development program, the Ministry of Public Utilities also requires additional funding in the amount of $59.4 million for projects including additional transmission infrastructure at the Union Estate Gandhi Village 220 kilovolt double circuit, the site of the recent cause of the nationwide power outage. So this is to establish secondary redundancy there to avoid a repeat of what happened there. Sum of $2.3 million for renewable energy for wind LIDAR units. Sum of $35 million for community water improvement programs, 34 projects across Trinidad. Sum of $1 million for the upgrade of the network service infrastructure. Sum of $1.4 million for geostationary operational environmental satellite receiving system to allow the Met Office to improve its environmental monitoring. The sum of $1.7 million for the refurbishment of the radar tower at Brasso Venado. The Ministry of Energy is receiving interim additional funding in the sum of $300 million to meet the shortfall in subsidy with respect to the sale of petroleum products up to September. This is in addition to a surplus of $500+ million that was generated in previous years, which will be added to this $300 million, making total expenditure on subsidizing motor fuels and LPG over $800 million in this period. The Ministry of Social Development and Family Services will receive an additional sum of $390 million to facilitate payment to senior citizens. And Madam President, just may I say, we certainly have an aging population. People are living far longer than they used to, and therefore the number of persons on the list with respect to senior citizens' pension is constantly increasing, notwithstanding the pattern of births and deaths. Our people are living longer, and therefore pension allocations are constantly increasing and now exceed $4 billion a year. That again is a huge sum of money, Madam President. I think I want to repeat that the government spends over $4 billion a year, every year, on senior citizens' pension. The Industrial Court will get $7.9 million. The Judiciary will get $30.3 million for various things, to pay electricity bills, to pay for contract officers, to pay for outstanding telephone bills, for security, janitorial, etc. The Parliament is getting $4.1 million to pay gratuities to persons who have completed their contract appointments, as well as contract officers whose appointments will be completed in this fiscal. Service Commission is getting 14.4 million. Again, a recurring theme, to pay arrears to TNTech, pay arrears to TSTT, to deal with rental of properties. Some of the bills that the government has, which we find it difficult to pay from time to time because of cash flow constraints, are electricity, telephone, water, rental of properties, janitorial services, security services. So we're taking the opportunity, because of improved cash flow, with this supplementation to clear off a number of these things, in addition to accelerating the VAT refunds. As I indicated in the other place, we have allocated an additional $1.6 billion for VAT refunds, and you're not going to see it in this supplementation because the VAT refunds are part of the VAT revenue. So that when you see a figure for VAT in the estimates of revenue, that is a net figure. So it takes into account the gross VAT collections and the refunds made. So we are reducing the net revenue figure for value-added tax in 2022 by paying out an additional $1.6 billion in refunds over and above what we plan to pay. So as I said, a recurring theme is payment of gratuities, TSTT bills, TNTech bills, security, janitorial, rental, and so on. The EBC is getting money to deal with outstanding allowances, to pay TSTT arrears, to pay persons on short-term contracts, and also to assist with upgrading its IT infrastructure, allowing it flexibility in terms of advertisements, and also giving the EBC funds to continue one of its core functions, which is the registration of electors. This is supposed to be an ongoing exercise at the EBC. It requires payment of salaries to persons on a short-term basis. It requires contracted services. It requires equipment and supplies for all of the persons who will be going out into the field to verify electoral information, and therefore there's a total aggregate within the EBC in terms of additional appropriation for short-term employment, additional appropriation for contracted services, additional appropriation for goods and services and supplies, totaling $10 million for this fiscal to allow the EBC to continue to keep its records up to date. Tax Appeal Board will be getting $1.8 million for rental accommodation, among other things. The Registration Board will get additional funding for consultancy services, for upgrade of its air conditioning system, and so on. The Public Service Appeal Board will get additional funding for rental accommodation. The Office of the Prime Minister will receive $59.9 million for fees for the Commission of Inquiry into the land acquisition process carried out by NIDCO for the Solomon Hocha Extension Project, to pay contract officers in the Division of Gender Affairs, and again a recurring theme, to pay arrears to TNTech, TSTT, and also to assist the Communications Division to train its staff and to place advertisements within the traditional media. There's also $26.7 million for various elements within the child care and protection sector, $1 million for non-profit institutions, children's homes, $289,000 for St. Dominic's Children's Home, $3 million for St. Jude's, and $22.3 million for the Children's Authority. There's also $500,000 for the Cyril Ross Home and various other supplemental appropriations to deal with debt servicing and so on. We are also giving the THA $60 million to facilitate the payment of outstanding debts to the National Helicopter Services. The THA uses the National Helicopter Services to transport critically ill patients from Tobago to Trinidad in the event that there is a critically ill person who requires tertiary care or specialist health care that is not available in Tobago. These persons are airlifted to Trinidad to the various RHAs, such as the North Central RHA, and so on, for tertiary healthcare and for specialist healthcare, so that we are providing 27.8 million for clearance of a debt owed to National Helicopter Services Limited, and also 19 million to clear off a debt owed to TN Tech, and also 13 million for gratuities for persons who have completed their appointments. That's THA. Total 60 million. The Central Administrative Services in Tobago will be getting additional funding of 2.6 million for rental, accommodation, for janitorial services, security services, etc. Personnel Department is getting 8.2 million, that's the CPO's office, for payment of salaries to monthly paid officers, rental accommodation, short-term employment, gratuities, etc. The Personnel Department is also getting a further 1.5 million under the development program to develop the its human resource capacity. Also, to look at the Public Service Employee Assistance Program, to review it, and also to outfit the building that it occupies at 3 Alexandra Street, St. Clair. The Office of the Attorney General will receive 79 million for acquisition of new polymer certificates for births and deaths and other similar matters that the Office of the Attorney General deals with, to pay for arrears of salary due to revised terms and conditions for contract officers, for short-term employment, to pay fees to local and foreign attorneys and accountants, to meet gratuity payments and so on. The Integrity Commission will get an additional 350,000 for the employment of persons on a short-term basis, consultants, I believe. The Ministry of Rural Development, Local Government, is getting 95.3 million to deal with expenditure associated with the implementation of the Public Procurement Act, digitization of the ministry's records, materials for the National Cleanup Campaign, additional funding for CPEP, and also additional funding, supplementary funding for personnel expenditure in all 14 corporations, totaling 40.6 million. Works and Transport is getting 97 million to pay to arrears of payments for contractors for works completed last year, for rental of equipment, for desilting of water courses, and also to award contracts for desilting of water courses, and also to assist the Airports Authority, which is quite challenged because of the closure of our borders and the suspension of air traffic. It's coming back up, but it has not yet reached the level where the Airports Authority can generate sufficient revenue from landing fees and other fees and charges to cover its expenses. So to support the Airports Authority to maintain a fully functional international airport in the same way we are supporting Caribbean Airlines to a significant amount, we are providing 66.7 million to support the Airports Authority in fiscal 2022, a subvention as it were. Housing and Urban Development is getting 76 million to pay contractors for the provision of various services, recurrent services, waste disposal, building maintenance, etc. 67 million for that. And then for the payment of principal on a UDICOT loan for the construction of the phase 1 of the Piccadilly Street Urban Regeneration Project. The Ministry of Housing is also getting 27.3 million under the development program for the rehabilitation and maintenance of HCC rental apartments, pay outstanding bills for rehabilitation work, for housing grants, a further 4 million, and 11 million for the development of residential lots for Petrotrin workers, former Petrotrin workers. The Ministry of Planning is getting 9 million for the payment of arrears of salaries and subsistence allowance at the EMA, based on a new collective agreement and industrial court judgment. The Equal Opportunity Tribunal is getting $2.4 million for various things, increments, contract officers, subscription and legal fees, security services, etc. Ministry of Agriculture is getting $120 million to enable the agriculture surveys and mapping and forestry divisions to pay allowances for animal production and health, etc., to enable payments for traveling and subsistence and so on, for short-term employment, and to assist with the payment of salaries for the Caribbean Fisheries Training and Development Institute, Caribbean Agriculture Research and Development Institute, Sugarcane Feed Center, farmers' incentives for the period up to 22, $7.7 million, and also to facilitate payment of principal on a loan for the settlement of a judgment debt incurred by EMBD in previous years. With respect to Ministry of Sport, the sum of $67 million is being provided to meet gratuity payments for contract officers and to pay arrears to MTS for security and other services in the sum of $62 million. Ministry of Tourism and Culture is receiving $20 million to meet a principal payment on a TT $100 million loan facility, which was taken out to provide assistance to artists during the COVID period and also to clear off a lot of bills that the NCC had. And I want to make the point, Madam Speaker, in the other place, I heard, I'm trying not to be unparliamentary, but I can't, I heard a lot of nonsense about allocations for debt servicing, that this will create a debt burden. It's the exact opposite. When you provide funding for the payment of principal, you are in fact paying down your debt and reducing your debt. So we are taking the opportunity with this supplementary appropriation, not just to pay bills, long outstanding bills, VAT refunds, etc. We are also paying down the public debt so that it will continue to go down. If I could just turn very briefly to the fiscal outturn. I think I've dealt with all the heads of expenditure now. Who is grumbling over there, Madam President? Okay. Still grumbling? The 2022 budget projected an overall fiscal deficit of $9.095 billion, 5.8% of GDP. This deficit of $9.05 billion was expected to take place in installments over the 12 months of the fiscal year from October 21 to September 22. So the budget division had estimated that by the time March 31st, 2022 arrived, we would have an overall deficit of some $4.75 billion out of the $9.09 billion for the whole fiscal year. However, we have benefited from significant additional revenue, in particular from the petrochemical companies. And this is what allows us to pay these supplementation. I'm putting it in context, Madam President. The way we can pay the supplementation is that the fiscal accounts are performing better than expected. So even though we are seeking Parliament's approval for additional and supplementary funds in the amount of approximately $3 billion, the revenues have improved so that we expect additional revenues exceeding $4 billion. So that I will just give some brief details on how we're going to pay for this additional supplementation. So, because that I want to defeat the argument that this is going to increase the debt burden. It's simply not true. We are paying for the supplementation entirely out of additional revenues. So that we had expected by this time that we would have a deficit of expenditure over revenue of $4.75 billion by the end of March. However, based on the actual revenue received and the expenditure incurred, the government recorded a surplus of $654 million by the end of March. Significantly more. If you take the two figures together, one is a negative, one is a positive. It meant that the fiscal accounts performed to the tune of $5.4 billion better than expected. So instead of a deficit of $4.75 billion, we had a surplus of $654 million. This is as a result of higher than projected revenue of $3.13 billion and a reduction in expenditure of $2.2 billion, because we're still being very, very careful, Madam President. We can't continue to run deficit budgets. We've had to do this for all sorts of reasons over the last 6 years. We've had to run deficit budgets because of the collapse of oil prices between 2015 and 2016, from $100 down to $25 in just 12 months, or less. Actually, from July 2014 down to July 2015, down to 2016, the price went from 100 down to 25. So we had to run a deficit. But the revenue began to improve, we reduced the expenditure, the deficit shrank, and we were very close to achieving a fiscal balance in 2018, 2019, then COVID hit. So we've had to run deficit budgets from 2015 to now. Previous government also ran deficit budgets, but you can't continue to run a country like that, because a deficit means that you have to finance it, and you finance it either from borrowing or from withdrawals from your sovereign wealth fund. So that we achieved a surplus in March because of higher revenue, and we're still managing expenditure quite tightly. The budget division is looking at all of the inflows and the outflows. We're always looking at cash flows. We're always projecting cash flows. We're all every day managing the cash flows and so on. And we expect to continue to have certain savings in certain areas, and we expect to have additional expenditure in certain areas. So that total expenditure has now been revised upwards to $55.19 billion, up from the original figure, an increase of about $2.76 billion. We were just over 52 when we did the budget, 52.4 thereabouts, and we expect it now to go up to 55.12, an increase of 2.76 billion. But again, we will continue to tightly manage expenditure, so we may not spend that entire 2.76 billion. And that, if you look at the pattern over the last 6 years, that is our pattern. We have tightly controlled expenditure, very prudently manage the revenue that we have. So that the 2022 budget was predicated on an average oil price of US $65 per barrel and a natural gas netback price of US 3.75 per MMBTU. In the 2022 budget, because this is a supplementation to the 2022 budget, and again, putting it in context, total revenue was announced at $43.3 billion. Total expenditure, $52.4 billion. Those were the estimates at that time. And that gives us the deficit of $9.09 billion, estimated at that time. The revenue at this time, we are being very conservative. We're using an oil price of $95 per barrel, and we're using a gas price of $5 per barrel. And if you'll permit me, Madam President, just let me take a look. Oil is $112 today, and natural gas is $8.13. Now that price that is quoted, that Henry Hub price, can be misleading, because in Trinidad and Tobago, we use a basket of natural gas prices. Now over the last 6 years, we've had discussions and negotiations with the energy companies, and we now use a basket of prices. This is how we get additional extraordinary revenue. So we use the Henry Hub price, which is a North American standard. We use a European benchmark, and we use a Far East benchmark to give us a formula, insert that into a formula to give us extraordinary additional revenue, so that the natural gas price that will be used for the budget is not $8.13. In addition, that quoted price, Henry Hub, is not a net back price. You have to subtract from that the cost of transportation of LNG and also regasification of LNG at the final destination, wherever the gas arrives, to get the net back price, which is what you use in the budget. So our net back price of $3.75 per MMBTU was predicated on assumptions relating to the transportation costs for LNG, and also assumptions predicated on the cost for regasification and other costs associated with natural gas production. Right now, we're looking at least $5 per MMBTU as a net back price going forward, but maybe more. So we've been extremely conservative. So using an oil price of $95 and a gas price of $5, we have, and also taking into account the reduction in revenue from the additional VAT refunds. I wish to make the point that when you pay out more VAT refunds than you planned, it reduces your overall revenue figure. So taking that into account, the reduction in revenue as a result of the payout of VAT refunds and the conservative oil price of $95 per barrel and the conservative gas price of $5, we expect an increase in total revenue of $4.125 billion in this fiscal year. If this works out, and if our projected increase in overall expenditure, when you take into account the supplementation and the expected savings in various multiple heads of $2.76 billion, we expect the deficit to be reduced from 9.09 down to maybe 7.7 or lower. In fact, I do expect it to be lower, because the figures assume that we will spend every cent that we are appropriating, which, as I said, over the years, we have tightly managed this. So we should have a much better performance in 2022. I don't want to talk out of turn. I don't know what the deficit is going to be, but I know it's going to be much less than $9 billion. Now, the increase in revenue is mainly increased income from taxes on income and profits, primarily oil and gas, and other companies. And other companies in the books, when you look in the revenue document, and you see a line that says other companies, that means the non-oil sector in terms of traditional non-oil manufacturing, retail, financial services, construction, etc., plus petrochemical companies. So petrochemical companies are lumped in that definition, other companies. So we do expect significant increase in revenue. We've already started to receive it from the petrochemical companies, and that is because of the extraordinary prices of petrochemicals, primarily for food production, fertilizer, ammonia, urea, etc. Some of these prices are 2 and 3 and sometimes 4 times what they were 2 or 3 years ago. That's a product of demand from the developed countries and the emerging economies, from large economies like China and so on, the demand for fertilizer in the United States, demand for fertilizer, recovery from COVID and so on, and also the war in Ukraine has contributed in some way to this, so that we find that petrochemical prices are now much higher than they used to be, which is helping our revenue situation in Trinidad and Tobago tremendously. In terms of the actual numbers, I can give some details. Just excuse me 1 second, Madam President. And I am watching my time.
Acting Prime Minister, you have 5 more minutes.
Pardon?
5 more minutes.
Yes, I have a stopwatch running here. So, Madam Speaker, the primary increases in revenue for 2022, as I said, focus mainly on improved revenue from oil and gas sector, but also from petrochemical sector and so on. Taxes on incomes and profits, we expect it to be up by 3.2 billion. Taxes on goods and services, that's value-added tax, 178 million, despite the fact that we are putting out significant refunds. International trade, customs duties, that's 22 million. Unemployment fund, which is derived from oil companies, up by 122 million. Green fund, again, primarily from the energy sector, up by 207 million. And then we have some lower than projected receipts in some areas. The petrochemical sector in particular is contributing almost $2 billion in additional revenue in 2022. So those are some of the numbers. In the short time remaining to me, Madam President, I'd just like to give some information because, as I indicated at the beginning of my contribution, this is not a budget speech. This is a supplementation of appropriation. As I said, every time I do this, I hear people talk about why didn't I talk about this and why didn't I talk about that? Well, I have 45 minutes. They seem to think I have 450 minutes. And it would be a disservice to the Senate if I did not deal with the matter at hand, which is the supplementary appropriation to ministries. And I did not explain. But commentators are mischievous. So let me just make some points here. The public debt is coming down. It was 130.6 billion at the end of December 21. It is now $129.8 billion. We haven't borrowed for 5 months. The overdraft limit has dropped from the usual 80 to 90% last year to 50% at this point in time. Our debt to GDP, because our GDP is now far more than originally estimated, we had used preliminary data at the time of the budget. We now have actual data for 2021. Our GDP is now $180 billion, up from 151 at the time of the budget. And the GDP for 2021 is now confirmed at 170 billion. What this means is that instead of a debt to GDP ratio of 87%, which is what we thought it was when we had preliminary data from the CSO last year at budget time, it was in fact 77%, 10% lower. And now, today, it is 72%, 15% lower than it was thought to be in 2021. This gives us far more fiscal space than we thought that we had and puts Trinidad and Tobago in a much better position to deal with critical expenditure. And in fact, when I look at the graphs, which we will be publishing in due course, you will see a significant recovery of our GDP, both nominal and real GDP, starting at the end of 2020 and climbing to a point now where our GDP in 2022 is higher than it was in 2015, Madam Speaker. You know, the commentators like to say a lot of things that are simply not correct. Our GDP is now higher than it was in 2015. I want to repeat that. So, Madam Speaker, with these few words, I beg to move. Madam President, sorry, I apologize.